How long did you know? Owen didn't answer right away. Before you signed your page. How long did you know? He looked at the open ledger between them instead of at her. Guess. A week. No. Since the funeral then. You just, no. She sat back. The chair scraped against the floor of the small office behind the hardware store, the only sound besides the ceiling fan Aldrich never turned off. 10 years, Owen said. Every single one of them was you. Freya didn't move. 11 entries, he said, and slid the ledger an inch toward her, the way you'd push a bill across a counter to someone who never asked for the check. Going back to the year I was 22, my mother's hospital account, my sister's tuition, a month of rent, the year the station almost cut my position, all of it anonymous, all of it you. You already knew someone was covering those, she said. You had to know. I knew someone was. I never let myself wonder who, because wondering felt like a door I wasn't allowed to open. He tapped the page. Aldrich kept that door locked for 40 years. You kept it locked longer than that. He looked down at the ledger for the first time since walking in. Her name wasn't written anywhere on it in her own hand, only in his, in the column where he'd finally signed to claim what he'd received. You let me think I was the only one still holding on to this town, she said. Owen didn't answer that either. Some questions weren't the kind you got to answer twice in one sitting, and he'd already used his best one. Through the wall, they could hear Aldrich moving boxes of old ledgers around the front counter, humming something tuneless the way he always did when he wanted two people to know he could hear them and had no plans to walk in. Freya closed the ledger without signing hers. 26 days, she said. That's what he told me. 26 days before this whole thing gets sealed and none of it ever gets to be real again. 29, Owen said. 9 days ago. 26, she said, quieter this time. I already lost 3 of them being too much of a coward to walk in the store. He wanted to tell her that made 2 of them. That would have meant explaining what he'd done with his own 9 days, and he wasn't ready to say that part out loud yet either. She stood, and for a second he thought she was going to leave the way she always left before anyone got the chance to ask her to stay. Instead, she stopped at the door. If you've known for 9 days, she said, why am I only hearing it now? He didn't have an answer that didn't require the whole story first, and the whole story started a lot further back than either of them wanted to admit out loud in that room. But to understand how I ended up on the wrong side of that table from her, I have to go back to 2 7-year-olds who had no idea what they were starting, in a town small enough that everyone eventually knows everyone's worst year. We met the way kids in a small town meet, which is to say, we didn't choose each other. A teacher put our desks together in September and forgot to separate us again. Freya Doyle drew horses in the margins of every worksheet she turned in, and I copied them badly enough that she finally started drawing me one of my own just so I'd stop ruining hers. By 14, we had a system nobody else understood. A specific knock on her window that meant, come outside. A specific silence on the phone that meant, don't ask me yet. A bench behind the ball field that belonged to us the way only kids can claim something that technically belongs to a whole town. By 17, her father hadn't worked steady in almost 2 years, and I knew it the way you know something you're not supposed to say out loud, from things that quietly stopped happening. The school trips she skipped, the way she started saying she wasn't hungry at exactly the times everyone else was eating. Her mother stopped coming to the door when I knocked, and started answering through the screen instead, always with some version of, she's resting, come back another time. Then one week in August, the porch light didn't come on. It didn't come on the next night either. By the 3rd night, there was a sign in the yard I didn't understand yet and a moving truck nobody had told me about. She was gone before I got there in the morning. No note under my door, no knock on my window one last time. Just 10 years of a specific kind of silence, starting with that one. We'd made a promise once, the summer we were 14, sitting on that bench behind the ball field with our sneakers hanging over the dugout wall. If it's ever really bad, she said, you have to tell me. Not later, not after you've already fixed it yourself on your own. I told her the same thing back, and we shook on it the way kids do when they haven't learned yet. How many promises like that end up broken by people who meant every word of them at the time? 3 years later, her house went dark on a Tuesday in August, and neither of us said a word about it to the other. My own father taught me the opposite lesson at that same kitchen table, a few years earlier, after he broke his hip on a job site with no insurance behind it. Half the town brought casseroles and cash in envelopes. He never quite thanked anyone for the right way, and I watched him get smaller every week. He had to keep accepting them, like every favor took something out of him that gratitude never put back in. Somewhere around 13, I decided I'd rather go under quietly than let anyone watch me shrink like that. It's a decent way to survive a childhood. It turned out to be a hard way to let anyone love you later. Her grandmother collapsed for the final time on a Tuesday afternoon, and Owen's crew got the call at 2004-7, the address flashing on the dash a full 3 seconds before he placed it. He came through the front door first, kit already open, and looked up mid-compression to find Freya kneeling on the other side of the gurney in scrubs, having driven straight over from the hospital the second the call crossed her own radio. Neither of them said a word through 11 minutes of trying. Their eyes met exactly once, across her grandmother's chest, in the specific silent language two people use when they've done this job long enough to already know what the monitor is about to say. It didn't work. By the time the coroner arrived, Freya was sitting on the porch steps in scrubs stained through at both knees, and Owen crouched in front of her, close enough to touch, not touching, saying nothing because nothing would have sounded like enough next to what had just happened. "It's been 10 years, she finally said, looking at the ambulance lights instead of at him. "And this is how we say hello." He didn't have anything to say back that wasn't either too much or not enough, so for the first time in a decade, he just stayed. Her grandmother's funeral was the first time the whole town had a reason to say her name out loud again, and it took less than an hour at the reception for someone to say mine right next to it. Owen. Old Mrs. Prescott caught his sleeve near the coffee urn, the way she'd been catching people's sleeves since before he was born. "You two were thick as thieves, weren't you? Did you ever hear from that Doyle girl again after everything?" "No," he said. Flat, fast, the kind of no that closes a door before anyone gets the chance to look through it. Freya was 8 feet away, close enough to hear every word, holding a paper cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. She didn't correct him. Neither did he. He set the coffee down on a folding table and took 2 steps toward him before she stopped herself, right there in front of the whole reception, one hand half raised like she meant to correct Mrs. Prescott after all. Then Sebastian said her name from across the room, and her hand dropped, and the moment closed the way most of the honest ones in that town closed that week. Quickly, and without anyone noticing it had almost happened. Sebastian found her by the dessert table a minute later, phone already in his hand, already scrolling to a flight confirmation he wanted her to see before she finished a single conversation about her own grandmother. "I moved the overseas start date up," he said. "Just by 2 weeks. It actually works out better for the visa timeline." He touched her elbow, steering her toward an empty chair. "You've barely eaten. You don't have to stay for every conversation people want to have with you today." It wasn't unkind. It also wasn't a question. She sat, because it was easier than explaining that she hadn't wanted rescuing from that particular conversation at all. She nodded at his screen without reading it, the way you nod at something just to make it stop being held up in front of you. Across the room, Owen watched her nod, and had no idea yet what he'd just watched. The funeral should have ended it there. 4 days, a casket, a reception, a lawyer's appointment about the house, a flight back out. Instead, the estate paperwork turned up a lien nobody remembered, and the 4 days became a week, and the week became something neither of them was naming yet. She kept finding reasons. The house still needed her. A water stain in the ceiling that had to be looked at before anyone could list it. A box of her grandmother's letters in the attic that couldn't just go out with a dumpster and a stranger's crew. Sebastian called about the movers twice a day. Voicemails piling up unheard on a phone she kept face down on the kitchen counter, like it was something that might go off if she looked at it wrong. Owen kept turning up at the edges of it without ever quite explaining why. He was the paramedic on duty the night the neighbor 2 doors down called about a gas smell, and he happened to be first on scene when the water heater in the empty house finally gave out and flooded half the kitchen floor. Small town rosters being what they are, none of it was strictly impossible. All of it added up was a little too convenient to be nothing. Then an elderly man 2 streets over went into cardiac arrest at his own kitchen table, and Owen's crew called it in on the way to the hospital, where Freya had picked up a single per diem nursing shift out of habit more than need. She was the one who met the gurney at the ambulance bay doors. "Compression started at what time?" she asked. "Pen already moving. All business." 14 after, he said. Neither of them looked up from the chart between them, and both of them noticed exactly how careful the other one was being about that. "You keep showing up," she said the 3rd time, standing in an inch of water with a mop she didn't know how to use on tile that old. "Small town," he said. "Small roster." "That's your whole explanation?" "It's the true one." She let it go, because he clearly wanted her to, and because pushing on it would have meant asking herself the same question about her own end of the coincidence, why she kept finding one more reason to still be standing in a town she'd sworn off at 17. By the 2nd week, she'd stopped pretending the estate paperwork was the reason. She told herself it was the letters in the attic, then the furniture that needed sorting, then a dentist appointment she actually had. Each excuse was true, and none of them was the actual answer. And every night she caught herself checking the ambulance bay's shift board on the town's public safety page before she could stop her own thumb from doing it. She ran into his mother outside the pharmacy on a Thursday, a woman she hadn't seen since before the stroke that had left her with a slight drag in one foot, and a cane she pretended not to need on good days. "Freya Doyle," his mother said, delighted, both hands closing around Freya's. "Look at you. Look at what you became." Freya asked how she was doing, and his mother, who had no idea whose money had kept her out of a collections office 9 years earlier, said the same thing she always said to people who asked. "We got through it. Somebody up there was looking out for us." Freya said she was glad, and walked the rest of the way to her car with her throat too tight to trust with anything else. Owen's crew chief noticed first. "You picked up 3 calls this week. You didn't have to be near," Ronan said, not quite a question, over coffee in the break room. Owen said the district was short-staffed. Ronan let it go the way you let something go when you already know the real answer and don't feel like making a friend say it out loud. One evening, off shift and restless, Owen drove past the old ball field out of habit and found her already there, sitting on the same bench behind the dugout like it had been waiting for one of them to remember it existed. He almost kept driving. He parked instead. "I used to come here to think when the house got loud," she said, before he'd even sat down, like she'd rehearsed the line in case he showed up. "Guess some habits don't actually leave when you do." He sat at the far end of the bench, close enough to talk, far enough to still call it nothing if anyone asked. "You disappeared for 10 years, and the first place you come back to is a dugout bench. It's the one thing in this town nobody could repossess." They talked for 20 minutes about nothing that mattered. Her nursing rotations, his call volume, a teacher they both hated in the same grade, and neither of them mentioned the 10 years directly. The way you avoid touching a bruise you already know is there. When she finally stood to leave, she paused just long enough to say, "It's good seeing you," and he didn't manage to say it back before she was already halfway to her car. His sister Marisol drove up for 2 nights before the reading of the will, mostly to make sure her brother was eating something that wasn't gas station coffee. Over dinner she brought up, unprompted, the scholarship that had covered her 2nd semester of college the year their mother's hospital bills should have made it impossible for either of them to afford anything. "I still think about who paid for that," Marisol said, turning her fork over without eating. "Some anonymous name on a form. I was so sure it was going to fall through that I didn't even unpack my dorm room for the first 2 weeks. "What semester was that?" Owen said, too fast, and Marisol looked up at the change in his voice before she answered. "Spring. My sophomore year." "Why?" He said it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was a date that lined up exactly with a summer he'd never let himself think too hard about. A summer that started with a moving truck he hadn't been warned about and ended with him telling himself the coincidence wasn't worth chasing any further than that. He didn't sleep well that night, running the math over and over on the ceiling of his own apartment. Spring, sophomore year, 10 years minus the first 2, when neither of them had anything to give. He got up at 2 in the morning and did something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. He pulled an old shoebox out of his closet, the one with every birthday card Freya had ever handed him through a bedroom window, and read the last one twice before putting it back exactly where it had been. Aldrich called him into the store 2 days later, ostensibly to ask about a part for the ambulance bay's sliding door. He didn't ask about the part. "I'm retiring," Aldrich said, setting 2 mugs of coffee on the counter neither of them had asked for. 40 years running that back office. The assistants committee takes it over in 30 days, and before they do, every open account on those books gets reconciled and named, or it gets sealed and shredded unread. Those are the only 2 ways this ends. "Why are you telling me first?" "Because your page has been open longer than most," Aldrich said. "And because I'd rather a man walk in on his own than find out later I let the door close on something that was his." He didn't say anything else. He never did, and Owen had known him long enough to understand that the silence afterward was its own kind of answer, the kind you weren't allowed to argue with. He put off retiring twice already, once for his wife's illness years back, and once because nobody else in town wanted the responsibility of knowing that much about their neighbors. This time, it wasn't optional. A doctor's appointment 2 months earlier had used the word manageable in a tone that made clear it was doing a lot of work in that one sentence. And Aldrich had decided, driving home from it, that 40 years of other people's secrets was enough to carry into whatever came next. 3 days later, Aldrich found Freya at the house, ostensibly returning a casserole dish left behind after the funeral. He told her the same thing, word for word, the way he told everyone the same thing. "The fund is closing. 30 days. Name it or lose it." She asked whether that meant her own account too, the one she'd assumed nobody but her had ever known existed. "Do you think it should be treated any differently?" he asked back. She didn't have an answer for that, and he took the silence for answer enough, the way he always did, and left with the empty dish under one arm before she could ask him anything else. Owen signed his page on a Tuesday afternoon, expecting a few short minutes and a formality he could get through without looking too closely at any of it. What he got was his own name in Aldrich's careful handwriting next to a column of dates going back further than he remembered needing anyone's help. 3 lines above the entry for his mother's hospital account sat a second name he hadn't been looking for and couldn't stop reading once he'd seen it. Freya Doyle. Recurring. Anonymous. Until now. He read it 4 times before the letters stopped rearranging themselves into some other, less impossible name. His hand was flat on the page like he could hold the ink still if he pressed hard enough. "Say, that's a mistake," he said to Aldrich, not looking up. "I don't make mistakes in that book," Aldrich said. "I make omissions, and there's a difference, and it's the only one I'm allowed to explain to you today." "Then explain the difference." "Not until she signs her own page." Aldrich closed the ledger under Owen's hand, gently, the way you'd take a hot pan away from someone before they noticed they were still holding it. "That's not me being cruel to you. That's 40 years of a promise I made to a lot of people who are counting on me to still mean it on my last week of keeping it." Aldrich had been running that back room since he was younger than either of them were now, ever since an unpaid tab in his own father's ledger got mentioned carelessly at the counter one afternoon and ended a 30-year friendship before the day was out. He'd sworn to himself, watching that happen, that if he ever ran the books he'd carry them the opposite way, no name leaving that room attached to another name unless the person carrying it chose to hand it over himself. Owen stood in the parking lot for a long time after that. Engine running, not driving anywhere. Somewhere behind him, through the store window, Aldrich went back to restocking screws by size like the last 10 minutes hadn't happened at all. For 4 days he did nothing about it, which is its own kind of loud when you've spent 10 years being the person who does something the second anything looks like it's about to fall apart. He canceled the one dinner he'd already half agreed to, a casual thing at the diner Freya had suggested, texting a vague excuse about a shift change that wasn't real. He stopped walking past the hardware store on his lunch break, a habit he hadn't noticed he'd built until he caught himself actively rerouting around it. He picked up an extra shift he didn't need, the kind of decision his crew chief raised an eyebrow at without asking a follow-up question, because everyone who'd worked with him long enough knew that extra shifts were what Owen did instead of talking about things. On one of those shifts, close to midnight, his crew answered a call for chest pains that turned out to be nothing worse than a bad panic attack, and the man's wife sat in the back of the ambulance the whole ride holding his hand, saying the same 4 words over and over. "I'm still here! I'm still here!" Owen wrote up the report afterward and sat alone in the ambulance bay for 10 minutes before he could make himself go back inside, because there was a version of those 4 words he badly wanted to say to somebody, and no idea yet how to start saying it. Marisol called twice that week to check in, and both times he almost told her everything. The ledger, the name, the 11 entries, and both times he asked about her commute instead, her new apartment, anything that wasn't the actual reason his voice sounded off. He almost told his mother too, sitting at her kitchen table on a Sunday, watching her set out 2 mugs from muscle memory, even though her doctor had cut her back to decaf months ago. She asked why he seemed distracted, and he almost said Freya's name right there, at the same table where he'd once done homework with the girl his mother still occasionally asked about out of nowhere. Instead, he said work had been busy, and his mother let it go, the same careful way she let most things go now, like she'd learned better than anyone in the family that pushing rarely got you the real answer any faster. He kept the printed ledger page folded in his jacket pocket the entire time, taking it out at night to read it under the kitchen light like the words might have changed since that afternoon. They never had. 11 dates, 1 name, 10 years of him thinking he was the only silent one in this story. He saw her once during those 4 days, from across the parking lot outside the pharmacy, and for a second, she lifted a hand like she might wave. He got into his truck instead, telling himself it was because he was already running late for a shift, which was true, and also not the reason, which he knew before he'd even pulled out of the lot. He drafted a message on his phone 4 separate times. The first was 3 sentences and started with, "I found something in Aldrich's ledger." He deleted it before finishing the second line. It read like an accusation, and none of this had ever felt like a crime to him, only like something too large to fit inside a text. The second draft tried to be casual. Can we talk sometime? No rush. And he deleted that one too, because there was nothing about this that felt like no rush, not with 20-some days left on Aldrich's clock and a moving date somewhere on Sebastian's calendar getting closer every time his phone buzzed, face down on her counter. The third draft he let sit unsent overnight, which felt like progress until he read it again in the morning and understood exactly why he hadn't sent it. It read like a debt being called in. 10 years of favors, one message, please explain yourself. That wasn't what he wanted from her. He didn't know yet what he did want, only that it wasn't that. The fourth draft was one line. Can I ask you something? He typed it, looked at it, thought about Sebastian's boxes already taped shut in her grandmother's front hall, and deleted that one too, because a question felt like the start of something he had no right to begin 3 weeks before she got on a plane. Freya came into the store on the 21st day, 3 weeks later than the schedule Aldrich had quietly hoped for, wearing the specific look of someone who has talked herself into and out of a doorway more than once that same morning. I heard you're closing the books, she said, before Aldrich could ask why she'd waited. I am, Aldrich said, and I heard you've been avoiding a hardware store for 3 weeks in a town with one road through it. He slid the ledger across the counter, already open to her page. She read her own column the way you read something you wrote a long time ago in different handwriting, recognizing the shape of it before the meaning caught up. Her name, next to dates, next to a fund she'd fed a little at a time out of nursing school paychecks that were never as large as she let people believe. She'd never thought of it in years as anything but a habit, something she did the way other people donate a coat every winter without keeping score of who receives it. Sign here, Aldrich said, tapping the line. And I have to tell you something I've never told anyone in 40 years of running this. Someone already knows what's on this page. He's known for 11 days, and he hasn't said a word to you. Her hand stopped over the pen. 11 days, she said, and nothing. That's not for me to explain, Aldrich said, which she was starting to understand was the only sentence he ever said twice. She signed. Then she went home and pulled every year of her own giving into one column on a sheet of paper, the way you'd lay photographs out on a table to finally see the shape of a decade instead of 11 separate moments you'd never once compared to each other. 22, his mother's stroke, the hospital balance she'd covered without ever admitting to herself that the woman's face had once made her breakfast every day, one whole summer, back when her own house had stopped having breakfast in it at all. 25, a line item on a memo about a paramedic position the county nearly cut, funded quietly enough that Owen never learned his own job had needed saving. She remembered that one specifically because it had scared her the most. A county budget memo, forwarded to her by a friend still working dispatch, listed 3 paramedic positions on a proposed cut for the following fiscal year, his name third on a roster of 5. She'd called Aldrich that same week and asked, for once, exactly how much it would take to make a line item disappear before anyone with a vote ever saw it. He never told her whether it had worked. She found out only now, a decade later, reading the word approved in her own handwriting next to a date she'd nearly forgotten. 26, his sister's tuition, the semester Marisol had described at a dinner Freya wasn't even at, and would never have connected if she hadn't been the one standing in Aldrich's office reading her own handwriting back to herself for the first time. 28, a name on nothing more than a note, no dollar amount, no account number, just a single line in Aldrich's own hand, check on him, he's not doing well after the Howison call, don't let him know it's you. She didn't remember writing those words herself, only remembered the year, the worst one, when a call gone wrong had put him in front of a review board and nearly cost him more than the job. She'd never known any of the details. She'd only known, somehow, that he needed someone watching and had asked Aldrich to be the one watching so Owen never had to find out anyone was. She sat at her grandmother's kitchen table with the list in front of her and understood, slowly, that she hadn't been giving to the town in general the way she'd always told herself. She'd been giving to one family, over and over, every single year, and calling it something else so she wouldn't have to say his name out loud, even to herself. She remembered the first one clearest of all. Sitting in her dorm room the year she turned 22, reading a local notice online about a stroke and a hospital balance and a house that had almost gone to collection, and recognizing the address before she'd even finished the sentence. She transferred what she could that same night, more than she could actually spare, and told herself it was just decency, the kind anyone would show a stranger. It took her 10 years to admit that no version of decency explains checking a hospital's assistance updates for one specific family, once a year, every year, without fail. Somewhere in all of it, she thought of the promise from the ballfield bench, the one about saying it out loud if things ever got really bad, and understood for the first time that she'd found her own private way of keeping it, even after she'd broken every other part of it. Sebastian called that same afternoon with the moving date pushed up another 2 weeks, unaware he was now racing a decision his fiancée hadn't told him existed. "The overseas board wants us settled before the quarter turns over," he said. "It's actually good news. Less time in limbo." She said that sounded fine. The way she always said things sounded fine to Sebastian, and hung up feeling like she'd agreed to something she hadn't actually heard him ask. He tried again 2 nights later, sitting across from him on a video call with her laptop propped on her grandmother's kitchen table. "I might need a little more time here than we planned," she said. "There's more to sort through than I expected." "How much more time?" he said, already reaching for something off-screen, already turning it into a number he could plan around. "A month. Maybe less. The board's expecting a start date. I can push it once, not twice, and pushing it once already costs us the signing bonus." He said it gently, the way he said everything, which was exactly why she'd never once told him no about anything that mattered to her more than it seemed to matter to him. "Let's just stick to the plan," he said. "It's easier that way," she agreed, because agreeing was easier than explaining what she couldn't yet explain to herself. Marisol figured it out 3 days later, in the hospital parking lot, without meaning to say anything at all. She ran into Freya coming off a shift, and somewhere in the small talk about the funeral and the house and the town, she mentioned the scholarship again, this time by year, the way you say a fact you've said 100 times and never expect to land differently. "I still don't know who to thank for that semester," Marisol said. "Whoever it was changed my whole life and never let me say a word about it." Freya's face did something small and involuntary, something Marisol had spent enough years reading in patients' families to notice immediately. "You knew," Marisol said, slower now. "You knew who it was this whole time." Neither of them said the name out loud. It didn't need saying. It hung in the parking lot between them the way a fact does right before it becomes impossible to unknow, and Marisol drove straight to her brother's apartment that same night, sat down across from him at his own kitchen table, and asked the only question she'd been carrying since her own face had given the truth away. "Why did you never say thank you to her? She paid for my whole life, and you've known for weeks and said nothing?" Marisol's voice cracked on the word nothing. "She's leaving in 3 weeks, Owen. Everyone in this town seems to know that except apparently you, standing here doing exactly what you always do." "And what's that?" he said, already knowing the answer before she gave it. "Deciding on your own that everyone's better off if you just carry it quietly." Owen didn't have an answer that fit inside one sentence, so he gave her silence instead, and Marisol had known her brother long enough to recognize that silence for exactly what it was. Aldrich closed his ledger for the final time 2 days later, both pages signed, both names finally on record for the committee that would take the fund over inside the week. He allowed himself, for the first time in 40 years running that back office, one sentence that wasn't strictly required of him. "She asked me every year," he told Owen, setting the closed book on the counter between them like a period at the end of a very long sentence. "Every single year for a decade, she came in around this same week and asked if the fund still had a way to check that a certain family was doing all right. Never asked for a name back, never asked for anything back, just wanted to know you were okay." "Every year," Owen said. "Every year," Aldrich said. "That's the one thing I'm allowed to tell you now that the books are closed. What you do with it is yours to decide, not mine." Owen drove to her grandmother's house that same night with the folded ledger page still creased in his jacket pocket, the paper gone soft at the fold from 4 days of being carried and never once handed over. Boxes lined the front hall, taped and labeled in her handwriting. "Kitchen, keep, donate, unsure." Her flight was in 14 hours. Essen. He knocked before he could talk himself out of it a 5th time. She opened the door already knowing, somehow, before he'd said anything, the way you know a specific knock, even after 10 years of not hearing it. "I'm not here to ask why you left," he said. "I know why you left. I've had 10 years to guess, and I think I finally got there on my own." "Then why are you here?" "I want to know why you kept coming back. Anonymously, for 10 years. Why you never once let me know it was safe to come back for you too." She stepped back from the door, not quite an invitation, not quite a refusal, and he understood it as both at the same time. He followed her past the boxes lined up in the hall. "Kitchen, keep, donate, unsure," until they reached the table where one box sat open, half-packed, her grandmother's letters spilling out one side. On top of the pile sat a stack of birthday cards tied together with string, and he recognized his own handwriting on the top envelope before she could think to stop him from seeing it. She'd kept everyone he'd ever slid under her door as a kid, right up through the last summer, the same way he'd kept every one of hers in a shoebox 3 streets away that he'd taken out and read again just 4 nights ago. Leaving quietly was the only goodbye I trusted myself not to ruin, she said. If I'd said it out loud to you, I would have stayed, and staying meant watching everything fall apart in front of the one person whose opinion of me actually mattered. Giving anonymously let me keep loving this town, and you, without ever risking being needed by either of you again. Needed and then left behind. I only knew how to survive that once. I wasn't going to test whether I could survive it twice. You checked on me every year, he said. That's not distance. That's the opposite of distance. It was the only kind of close I knew how to be without getting hurt by it. You know why I never let myself wonder who it was, he said. My father spent half my childhood letting this whole town see exactly how much he needed. I watched what that did to him. I promised myself I'd rather go under quietly than owe anyone something they could hold over me later. I was never holding it over you, she said. I know that now. I don't think I knew it 9 days ago. Her phone lit up on the kitchen counter behind her, Sebastian's name across the screen, a boarding gate update 3 weeks early because he liked to plan ahead of every plan he made. She looked at it. She looked back at Owen, standing in a doorway he hadn't stood in for 10 years, holding a piece of paper with her name on it that he'd carried for 4 days because he hadn't known how to make it small enough to say out loud. She didn't pick up the phone. Ask me the real question, she said, not the one you think you're allowed to ask. Was any part of you hoping I'd find that ledger before you left? The phone stopped ringing on the counter. Neither of them looked at it. Every part, she said. I just never let myself believe you'd want to be standing here after you did. He was still standing there. Freya didn't take the overseas position in the end, and she didn't announce it or stage a scene about it or call Sebastian that night with some speech she'd rehearsed in a doorway. She simply asked him, 2 days later, over coffee that neither of them finished, for more time than he was willing to keep giving her. How much time, he said, the same question he always asked, already reaching for his phone to measure it against a calendar. I don't know yet, she said. That's the whole problem. I don't actually know. He turned the phone face down on the table instead of looking at it, maybe for the first time since she'd known him. You're not coming, are you? It wasn't cruel the way he said it. It just finally sounded like a real question instead of a plan, and she was grateful to him, in a small and complicated way, for asking it as one at last. No, she said. I don't think I am. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded at difficult numbers, and by the time the coffee went cold, neither of them had raised a voice even once. He left for the new position on schedule. He didn't fight for it beyond that one conversation, which told her, more than anything he could have said, that some part of him had already known this wasn't the plan she actually wanted. He sent one message a few weeks later from the new city, brief and kind, hoping she'd found whatever she'd stayed for. She had, and she told him so, and that was the last either of them needed to say. She stayed through the one thing she'd actually asked to stay for. Aldrich's last week behind that back office desk, helping him box up 40 years of ledgers that would never be opened by anyone else, entry by entry, name by name. The assistance committee sent 2 people from the county office to observe the handover, both of them younger than Aldrich had been when he started, both asking careful questions about spreadsheets and digital record-keeping that he answered patiently, without once mentioning that 40 years of the whole system had run on nothing more complicated than his own handwriting and his own word. Freya spent the week cross-referencing names against addresses so the new software wouldn't lose track of a single account, and Owen came by most evenings after his shift to carry boxes nobody had asked him to carry. Neither of them made anything out of that either. One afternoon that same week, the man whose chest pains had turned out to be nothing more than a bad panic attack came in to sign his own page, an account from 11 years back that had covered a funeral he'd never told anyone he couldn't afford. He cried at the counter, unembarrassed, and Freya handed him a tissue from a box that had clearly seen this scene before. Watching him sign his name to something he'd carried alone for over a decade, Owen understood, maybe for the first time all the way through, what it had actually cost people in this town to accept help quietly instead of ever saying it out loud. On his final afternoon, Aldrich set a new notebook on the counter between them, still shrink-wrapped, blank all the way through. The assistance committee's fresh start, the first page of whatever the fund would become without him running it out of the back of a hardware store. Somebody's got to open the first account, he said, sliding it toward them both instead of just one. Might as well be the 2 people who finally learned to sign their own names to something. He wrote their names at the top of the first page himself, before either of them could argue over who should go first, side by side instead of hidden at the bottom of a column 10 years down. Afterward, they walked out of the store together into the kind of evening that doesn't announce itself as different from any other, and somehow ended up at the ball field again, on the same bench, for no reason either of them bothered explaining out loud. She didn't ask if it was safe to stay this time, he didn't ask if she was leaving again. They just sat there until the streetlights came on. Two people who'd spent a decade taking care of each other from opposite sides of a wall. Neither of them had built on purpose, finally sitting on the same side of it. I still think, some nights on shift between calls, about the two different kinds of quiet I've lived in. There's the quiet you keep because you're afraid of what happens the moment anyone sees you needing something. And there's the quiet you choose because you finally stopped being afraid of that. The kind where the silence isn't hiding anything anymore. It's just two people, in a room, no longer needing a ledger to say what they mean. If you've ever loved someone from a safe distance because it felt easier than risking the real thing, ask yourself which quiet you're actually standing in right now. I spent 10 years sure I already knew. I didn't. Neither, it turns out, did she.